At no time in our lifetimes have we been more conscious of the people around us and how close those people were getting to us, or been more wary of physical contact in public places. We look around to see if people are wearing their masks and what else they're doing. Most of us are staying home, or at least sticking to our own neighborhoods. That's the reality of the coronavirus crisis. Well, I hope this makes white people more mindful of the fact that for African Americans, that kind of isolation, that social distancing, has been the reality they were forced to live with for the vast majority of our country's history. Being watched, being looked at as if they might have an infection that white people would catch. Now, obviously, things are dramatically better than they were before the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, egregiously belated as that was, and the plethora of other laws that were enacted in the subsequent years protecting the rights of African Americans and minorities in our country. But as white people, we don't get to declare the end of racism. As I tweeted some time ago, when the vast majority of African Americans believe racism is no longer a problem, then, and only then, will I believe that racism is no longer a problem. And how do we know racism is still a problem in our country? African Americans have 5 times the incarceration rate of white Americans, 3 times the poverty rate of white Americans. For every $100 of wealth white Americans have, African Americans only have $5. In fact, a white high school dropout, on average, has more wealth than an African American or Latino college graduate. Think about that. Now, all too many white people, whether they say it out loud or not, believe that these horrific statistics are due to some immutable deficiency among African Americans. Well, first of all, I'd say that those white people need to spend a whole lot more time with a whole lot more black people. But also, they're obviously glossing over the reality that black people are not just the descendants of another American immigrant group. Now, to be sure, few immigrants to this country had it easy, and throughout our history, many, many immigrants were horribly mistreated. But only African Americans were subjected to 250 years of slavery. Slavery in the country that extolled itself as the exemplar of freedom, democracy, and decency. Think about that. It's crazy. And then when the 13th Amendment was finally ratified, releasing African Americans from the bondage of slavery, for the next century, African Americans endured heinous oppression, wanton terrorism, incessant humiliation, unceasing marginalization. Had any other subset of the American population been a product of that sordid racial history, if any other group was still mired in the vestiges of that oppressive system, no rational person would ascribe its relatively disadvantaged status to a lack of ability or will. What if we took some of those babies born in Winnetka, Illinois, or the Upper East Side of New York, or Highland Park, Texas, and had them raised in these cauldrons of privation and dysfunction that are America's inner cities? Let's see how well they turn out in that environment. So should white people today feel guilty for the sins and crimes that previous generations of white people committed against African Americans? No, I don't think they should feel guilty for that. But white people today should feel guilty if they don't do everything in their power to promote African American advancement. Not just because it's what God would want us to do. Not just because it's what fulfilling the American spirit requires us to do. But because nothing less is acceptable in a great country. It is simply beneath our standard to allow the status quo to continue. So I pray that this coronavirus crisis leads white Americans to be much more mindful of what African Americans have endured, to be much more empathetic, and most of all, to be much more committed to turning things around and really aggressively fostering African American advancement in our country, because that is how we make America great.